at that time I had no idea about how to like work on myself psychologically, and I feel like what the antidepressants didn't do was help me get to the root of some of these issues that I was facing. Whereas on the other hand, psilocybin can bring a lot of that stuff to the surface, because it requires, in order to truly heal, we have to bring awareness or bring light to the issues that we're facing in our life that sometimes we're afraid to talk about, we're afraid to acknowledge, or stuff that we push down and stuff away, or try and avoid.
The topic of drug use is one that has simmered toward the surface of U.S. political discourse for decades, oftentimes hanging to the fringes of mainstream discussion, but never too far from sight. While cannabis remains prohibited by federal law, 33 states and the District of Columbia have nullified federal prohibition with laws recognizing medical use. DC and 10 of those 33 states have even gone so far as to allow recreational use. The medicinal values of the prohibited drug have been cited by various cannabis legalization efforts, and through this same thread, a new conversation has emerged around shedding prohibitions of other illicit drug substances. The city of Denver is now judging how far the arguments for drug decriminalization extend. A ballot initiative, cleared for the city's May 2019 special elections, would pose the question whether to decriminalize the psilocybin genus of mushroom, commonly referred to as magic mushrooms. The proposed initiative would place adults 21 or older who possess but do not sell these prohibited mushrooms as the city's lowest law enforcement concern, diverting police and court resources to other law enforcement issues. Kevin Matthews, the campaign director for Decriminalize Denver, the ballot initiative's leading proponents, shared his own personal experience with the issue and why he chose to advance magic mushrooms to the public forum.
For as long as I can remember, I had always wanted to be a career Army officer. Going as far back to 9 years old is when I basically told my dad, I was like, "Dad, I want to be in the Army," and he was like, "Well, you're smart enough to be an officer, and if you want to be an officer, you should go to West Point." And that just stuck with me for 10 years. I was one of those rare kids in my teenage years that never let go of dressing up in camouflage for Halloween, and just did that. Like, that was a very big focus of my life for a long time. Of course, getting into West Point was difficult. You have to have pretty good academics, you have to demonstrate leadership skills, be involved in a lot of extracurricular activities. And so most of my high school career was just really focused on doing well academically and playing lots of sports and just making sure I was a well-rounded candidate for West Point and for the Army as well. And yeah, it was June 2005 that I started at West Point and thrived in my first year. And it was in my second year that things started to go a little bit downhill. And it was my third year where I was actually diagnosed with major depression. And the Army doesn't necessarily have the tools, nor do I think should they necessarily have the tools to actually work with an individual like myself who's suffering from depression. And they did the best they could. And then I ended up receiving an honorable discharge and a medical retirement from the U.S. Army because of my depression. And yeah, I was discharged 10 years ago last December. So it's been 10 years of figuring out what the heck I'm doing with my life. It was because that part of my life was, I had the whole like 50-year plan, and had planned to just dedicate my entire existence to serving in the U.S. military. And when that went away, when it kind of, my foundation for myself and my personality kind of crumbled beneath my eyes. When I was at the academy, when I was still a cadet, I was seeing a therapist, psychiatrist at the academy. I was prescribed antidepressants and a sleep aid, and it was, it was still kept my, my regular routine. It's a very regimented lifestyle. We wake up at 5:30 in the morning, get ready for formation, and then go to breakfast and go to class, and then after class it's straight to after class activities, sports or training, and then mostly we're working until at least midnight on our homework, our school load. So none of that changed except for the fact that I was on antidepressants for about I think, if I remember correctly, about 3 months before I really had kind of my I guess for lack of a better term, a mental break, because I was suicidal. And so I basically said, I let my tactical officer and all of the right people know that I was not doing well, and then so I stopped going to class. When I was back, when on medical leave, when I came back to Colorado, I was still seeing a military psychiatrist here down at the Air Force Academy, which is in Colorado Springs, which is just about 2 hours south of Denver. And then we made the call, like, this isn't working out. It's time for me to resign my appointment to the academy. And yeah, it was a challenging moment for that, to make that decision. Talk to my dad, talk to my family, of course talk to my healthcare providers, and I think it was the right choice, because the last thing we need the last thing our military needs are officers leading men into combat, and if that officer has mental health issues, it's not the best combination.
Right.
I wanted to go fight our nation's wars and be in the infantry and live that lifestyle, and the decision was a tough one when I left. I was here in Denver for a couple of years, kind of rebuilding my support network, making new friends, making new connections. For me, I started getting into, it's kind of cliche, but I was getting into self-help and meditation, and starting to discover ways that I could work with my mental health and my mind and my spirit, and like reinvigorate that part of my life. And so for me, I met an incredible new community of people in Denver, new for me at the time, who were into yoga and meditation and different spiritual and like esoteric modalities, but they were living it. It was part of their life. It's this subculture, I guess you want to call it, of maybe a Burning Man subculture or something like that, where people are interested in exploring all the facets of what it means to be human. And yeah, it was this group of friends that were like, hey, we should try this, we should do this together and see how it goes. And it was on the outside, it may have looked like a recreational experience, but for me it was deeply therapeutic. It was here in Denver, just a couple miles east of where we are right now, at a friend's house, and we prepared for it. We set intentions. We thought about what we wanted to actually achieve and get out of the experience, and that I had been getting interested in, I mentioned some of these other like spiritual modalities, shamanism, or like anthropology for one. Like I was very interested in that, and like how other cultures were using these plant medicines as tools for healing. And yeah, so when it came into my awareness and when I had the opportunity, I jumped on it. And I was with people I trusted, and which is a big deal. It's really important for this. people I trusted, people who were new friends of mine who I cared about and who I wanted to hang out with and be close with, you know, and also individuals who had experience working in this dimension of altered states of consciousness, whether they're getting that from yoga or meditation, or whether they're getting that from plant medicines or mushrooms. So I trusted them, and we went through the experience, and it blew my perspective right open, because it, like, in a good way, it was like all of a sudden the fog had lifted, the clouds dissipated. I could see my life clearly. I could see the world clearly. It's like my soul had a new set of eyes to look through, and it was really such a. It's hard to describe the experience, because it was so powerful for me, knowing that I had this group of people who actually supported me and loved me and wanted me to be their friend. And you know, whereas before, still kind of suffering from depression and not really understanding the direction I want to take with my life, thinking that I was still this sense of worthlessness or being not good enough, really, sense of guilt and shame for how my life had turned out. Like, all that dissipated, and gave me the freedom to really, the experience gave me the freedom to jump back into my life instead of trying to run away or hide from it. Up until that point, nothing had been so impactful in helping me frame a new perspective about my own life. I think that's the part that really did it for me, is that and this is after the experience, because the experience was amazing, but it stayed for weeks and months afterwards, and I was still feeling like, wow, life is amazing. I can choose to create any kind of an experience I want. I can choose to think about my life the way that I want to think about it, without you know, all this negative self-talk that I was doing as a person with depression. You know, beating myself up mentally all the time on this constant feedback loop of, you're a piece of shit, you're not good enough, you failed at the academy, you failed at life. Like, you know, it's like that stuff all just went away, and I was able to frame a new perspective.
As Kevin Matthews described his personal experience with depression and its effects on his life, he opened up about his decision to try mushrooms for the first time.
My first kind of introduction to psychedelics as a medicine was through the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, and this was back in 2014 when I'd heard about their work using MDMA to help treat veterans who have severe PTSD, and how successful it was. And so I started following that, and from there that brought me to the research from these other organizations. I mean, you know, you mentioned Johns Hopkins. There's another organization called the Hefter Research Institute. There's the Beckley Foundation, and these are more like Johns Hopkins University and NYU have done a lot of these psilocybin studies, and then the Hefter Research Organization and the Beckley Foundation are both research organizations, not universities, but they help conduct this research, and they have clinicians who work with them as well. So yeah, 2014 was really my first introduction to psychedelics as a potential medicine, and my interest peaked, because I was like, this is amazing. I have friends who need this.
The Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Unit has been at the forefront of studying psychedelics, including these psilocybin magic mushrooms. Through over 15 years of examination, researchers on the team, like Roland Griffiths, have studied the applications of these drugs in the field of depression and mental health, and contributed to the changing attitudes and perception of these magic mushrooms.
Today I want to tell you about research with the classic psychedelic psilocybin that's showing that under supported conditions, psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences associated with enduring positive changes in attitudes, mood, and behavior. So we've conducted 3 rigorous double-blind studies in healthy volunteers. We've looked at dose effects, we've added controls for expectancy kinds of things, and These sessions for these studies are held in a living room-like environment. Before the first session, volunteers develop a trusting relationship with our session monitors, which reduces adverse effects of psilocybin. On session days, volunteers come in, they swallow a capsule. They're encouraged to lay on a couch, use eye mask and headphones through which they listen to a musical program and direct their attention inward. If fear or anxiety arise, then the monitors are there to provide reassurance. Now, psilocybin is a relatively short-acting drug, so by the end of the session day, these effects are gone. But vivid memories for these salient experiences endure. In one study, we had volunteers return a month after each session to complete some questionnaires. 80% of the volunteers in that study, after having 1 or 2 high doses of psilocybin, reported that the experience was among the 5 most personally meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives. These positive effects are sustained for at least a year and probably longer. And it wasn't just the volunteers who reported these effects. We did structured interviews with friends, family members, and colleagues at work. And this statistically verified the volunteers' reports. So we've continued this whole line of research over the last several years and studied other populations, the first of which are psychologically distressed cancer patients. So we've recently completed a study in 51 cancer patients with life-threatening cancer diagnosis who met clinical criteria for having a depression or anxiety disorder. These volunteers were randomly assigned to receive either a low dose or a high dose of psilocybin under double-blind conditions. Now, these results are still preliminary, but they're very promising. And what this graphic shows is the percentage of volunteers showing clinically significant improvement in depressed mood. The orange bar shows that 92% of those people who received the high dose of psilocybin 5 weeks after the session were reporting or were showing clinically significant improvements, much greater than the green bar that shows the effects after the low dose of psilocybin. The blue bar shows that the effects of this high dose of psilocybin are sustained out to 6 months. So about 80% are continuing to show clinically significant improvement. And in fact, in 70% of these, the symptoms have remitted to the normal range. We're showing similar effects for anxiety. These effects are really quite remarkable. What we're showing here is a single exposure to a substance producing substantial and enduring antidepressant and anxiolytic effects. Such an effect actually is unprecedented within the field of psychiatry.
When examining substances like psilocybin, one immediate roadblock comes from their legal status. Magic mushrooms are unavailable to the general public and are classified by the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency as a Schedule I narcotic. Schedule I drugs are seen as the highest risk for abuse while holding no treatment potential. By comparison, Schedule II drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, oxycodone, and fentanyl are recognized as dangerous, but which may hold some medicinal value. Schedule III drugs such as ketamine, anabolic steroids, and codeine are considered to have a moderate to low risk for addiction and abuse. Drugs like Xanax, Valium, and Ambien are in Schedule IV for their low risk of abuse and dependence. And finally, Schedule V drugs, including limited volumes of codeine, Lyrica, Lomotil, and Modafinil, are seen as having the lowest risk of abuse overall. Psilocybin wasn't always federally prohibited. In 1957, Swiss scientist Albert Hofmann first isolated psilocybin as a chemical compound. At the time, Hofmann had worked for the Swiss company Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, and by 1958 they had recreated the compound synthetically. In the 1960s, Sandoz had created and marketed indocybin, a direct derivative of psilocybin for use in psychotherapy. The pharmaceutical variant of the magic mushroom was used for a time, but was ultimately overcome by the events of the era. It was only a few years before the U.S. passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, effectively restraining the pharmaceutical industry and requiring their oversight over certain drug types, while simultaneously establishing non-pharmaceutical variants of drug compounds as controlled substances, divided into 5 schedules of control based on their abuse factor, medicinal value, and potential for harm. The United Nations carried forward similar proposals for regulating drug substances like psilocybin, and in Vienna, Austria, in February of 1971, they signed into effect the Convention on Psychotropic Substances. As these laws came into effect, Sandoz pulled psilocybin off the market, and what limited research data the pharmaceutical company had on the efficacy of their drug was overcome by a different agenda for the psychedelic drugs. Meanwhile, the passage of these laws, combined with the condemnation of the international community and the increased enforcement by a newly established Federal Drug Enforcement Agency in 1973, left the remaining free users of magic mushrooms and other psychedelics in a legally tenuous position. By 1978, the U.S. passed the Psychotropic Substances Act, effectively legally complying to the earlier UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and the drug-using counterculture in many ways receded into the background. While the changes in U.S. and international law through the 70s represent both a powerful and legally consequential perspective on drug use, and while the DEA scheduling of magic mushrooms placed them at the highest schedule of control, another consideration for the mushrooms comes from examining their real-world medical risks. The 2017 Global Drug Survey published a set of survey results from self-reporting drug users, wherein users described their instances of seeking emergency medical treatment through the ER. Magic mushroom users were the least likely to seek out an emergency room visit. Of a sample size of fewer than 10,000 users, 0.2% felt the need for an ER visit. Effectively, fewer than 20 people sought out an ER because of magic mushrooms. While it is difficult to find well-sourced instances of deaths in relation to magic mushroom overdose, there is a risk of misidentifying a different, toxic species of mushroom as one of a psychedelic nature, causing accidental poisoning. Still, of the number of magic mushroom users, there is a risk of bad trips, causing users to suffer a psychotic episode or inflict self-harm. Ranked in comparison, fellow Schedule I drug, cannabis, saw the second lowest risk of hospitalization. Of a sample of fewer than 60,000 users, fewer than 360 people needed to visit the ER. LSD, or lysergic acid, another classic psychedelic, ranked as the third lowest risk, averaging a 1% chance of ER hospitalization. Cocaine ranked similarly to LSD in terms of likelihood that its overall users would turn to an ER after a bad experience. Cocaine notably carries a risk of deadly overdoses, causing heart attacks, seizures, or strokes. This according to the National Institute for Drug Abuse. Amphetamines and ecstasy presented higher ER responses than cocaine still. Alcohol placed third in most likely illicit substances to cause an ER hospitalization. Synthetic cannabis ranked second in terms of the most likely drugs to cause an ER visit. And methamphetamines ranked number 1 overall as the drug most likely to result in an ER hospitalization, with 4.8% of all users seeking an emergency room response. According to the National Institute for Drug Abuse, methamphetamine use carries the risk of heart attacks, strokes, brain hemorrhaging, and lung collapse associated with an overdose. The Schedule II methamphetamines were effectively 24 times more likely to result in ER hospitalizations than magic mushrooms, And while instances of deaths by magic mushrooms are virtually unheard of, deaths caused by methamphetamine overdose are readily available to find.
I-300 and I-301 ordinance decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms and overturn that.
In the final weeks before the Denver elections, members of Decriminalize Denver set to work canvassing across Denver neighborhoods to spread the word and garner support for the ballot initiative.
So magic mushrooms are a tool for systemic change, in my humble opinion, because I believe drugs are software, and I feel like our society is running on the wrong software. We're running on caffeine, sugar, and alcohol, and that's producing antisocial, stupid behavior that's destroying the world. And so I believe that magic mushrooms are a tool for systemic change that are going to change the software. It would be pro-social behavior, creating, as opposed to alcohol, which produces antisocial, unpredictable behavior. Alcohol encourages people to, I don't want to bash alcohol, but comparing, I mean, we've already legalized one of the most dangerous substances known to man. It's lethal. This is a non-lethal substance. That produces pro-social behavior and therapy, and it has one of the highest therapeutic potentials there is. So this will create pro-social behavior, which encourages cooperation. Our society is so focused on competition, and there's not enough cooperation. People need to start cooperating in order to address the problems of the 21st century. The reason why drugs have been criminalized is because they produce behavior that encourages engagement politically. Okay, and so LSD was behind a lot of the anti-war movements that were squashed by the Nixon administration. They found out what drugs those communities were using, and they criminalized them. So we know that that's a huge part of motivating people to become activists and to become politically engaged, is to find out what software they're using, or what drugs, because drugs are like software. Denver elections right now, and well, not on a Sunday, but you can go and they will have everything ready for you. You just have to show your ID, and then you're there.
Okay. Cool. Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you recommend any of these?
Hey, do you guys want to donate $1 million to our campaign? Influence it is by corporate powers. This is, they're just trying not to give us any publicity for this. There's no opposition to 301 because they don't want to give us any publicity because they know it's popular.
As Decriminalize Denver's field team hit the streets, they had the chance to talk to voters and address questions and concerns about the confines of their initiative. While some expressed open support, others, like Denver resident Mansour Yusuf, expressed a need for caution going into the issue.
The availability is a concern for me, and what form it takes. I mean, the next thing you know, do we decriminalize magic mushrooms, start lacing, starbursts with them, and sell them at pot stores where, once again, you make, just like vaping, you make flavors like cotton candy and cinnamon. I mean, who do you think that's targeted towards?
Right.
So, there's always this spectrum, and although I agree with decriminalization, I mean, you just have to be smart about it and not let people come into the system and say, okay, well, it's decriminalized, so here we go. The floodgates are open, and let us just go all out with it. So just regulate it, do it in a cautious manner, and always keep in mind that kids are the key population that we have to protect from this stuff. There's a big difference between a vet needing mushrooms for PTSD and 16-year-olds wanting to just trip, right?
Okay.
And somehow when we decriminalize things and make them legal, the water flows downstream. It does affect our kids, and so we have to find a way to mitigate that.
Okay.
I think I'll definitely give it a serious thought. I think lately, having a 14-year-old, I've become a little bit jaded about the idea of making things legal. So I think my gut reaction would have been, no, not another thing in Colorado that's possibly going to be dangerous to kids. I don't want that to be legal. So I'd probably do my research a little bit more and give it a fair shot. So I'd like to, the main thing I'd like to research is who's really using it, who's really being put in jail for it. And if I come to find out, based on my research, that it really is people that are treating it like a medical, medical solution, then I think I'd be inclined to vote to decriminalize it.
Peter Droege, the Marijuana and Drug Addiction Policy Fellow for Colorado Christian University's Centennial Institute, expressed his own concerns about the potential decriminalization of these magic mushrooms, arguing that if there is a medical benefit to magic mushrooms, it would be better discovered through overall federal regulation rather than by decriminalization at a local level.
Even if it got to the point where a psychiatrist might see that there could be a potential benefit for one of his or her patients, and to be able to administer a drug like psilocybin mushrooms in a controlled setting where the recipient would be safe and would be properly dosed and observed. Again, if that's where it leads, there's a process that gets us there, but that process does not begin by legalizing it on the streets of Denver. The thing that residents of Denver really need to consider is that they would be essentially decriminalizing a drug that is illegal according to federal law. So, and there is a reason why we have the federal government in these cases. This psilocybin mushrooms are shown to result, first of all, in hallucinations, and of course that's why people take them, but also psychosis, and really, they can lead to essentially an overdose. Now, mushrooms are not any fatal overdose. I don't think that they necessarily would cause a fatal overdose, but just like with high potency marijuana, lots and lots of people find themselves feeling very uncomfortable taking a powerful drug, and then they wind up in the emergency room and they need to get treatment. So first, mushrooms are illegal according to federal law. Also, the argument that they can rewire one's brain, I think that we need to, take that on face value and say that that they may have some ability to rewire the brain. The problem is that they can either rewire one's brain in a good way or potentially a bad way. And let's make no mistake, for folks that really are not aware, psilocybin mushrooms and LSD, they're not the same chemical compound, but they are essentially very similar hallucinogenic drugs. So I've talked to reporters and they simply are not aware that psilocybin has much of the same hallucinogenic qualities as LSD. So I don't think people would be very readily willing to legalize LSD, but they are approaching this issue with psilocybin mushrooms differently. They think that it's not as powerful, that it has some therapeutic effects. It's important for folks to know that psilocybin mushrooms are a very powerful drug. They're illegal according to federal law. They cause hallucination, psychosis. And I think that for folks that saw, when marijuana was legalized in Colorado, I don't think people realized that marijuana is no longer Woodstock weed. It's not the 7, 8, 9% THC weed that, Grandpa smoked. It really is high potency. It's just THC in a purified form. So what Colorado has seen with high potency THC is an increase in emergency room visits, an increase in traffic accidents and fatal car accidents. And I think that a real concern for anyone is how hallucinogenic drugs like psilocybin will result in the same issues. People behind the wheel on mushrooms, or people walking down the 16th Street Mall on mushrooms, or people needing to go to the emergency room, and a lot of folks don't have insurance, so your taxpayers would be paying for that. So there's, I think, a lot of reasons why the public needs to get educated about this. the best of all worlds would be for a university like Johns Hopkins to be given permission by the FDA to do clinical trials and to do research on any potential medical benefits that psilocybin mushrooms may have. And you know, admittedly, the patients that would go in there, if somebody is suffering from PTSD or you know, just really is experiencing tremendous emotional and mental pain, and they might get some relief, then yeah, let's have the FDA allow certain universities to do clinical trials to work with some of these folks, and let's see if there may be benefits. That, I think, is the right approach. And oftentimes it's those folks that are really, really in the most need who have this last resort. Maybe, you know, frankly, I understand that there's a potential for, you know, that it may harm them very significantly. But on the other hand, it may help them. So I think that a valid alternative would be for the FDA to allow certain universities to do clinical trials. Let's really find out. Let's get it properly dosed. Let's get you know, real medical experts and researchers involved so that we could find out if there are any potential medical benefits. We've heard these same arguments with medical marijuana. And, you know, so Colorado passed a medical marijuana law. The very next thing they did was go for recreational. Now they're going for magic mushrooms, and our state legislature is trying to decriminalize all hard drugs from crack cocaine to meth to heroin. So, you know, it's clear that these folks have an agenda to legalize drugs. What their deeper agenda is probably fairly easy to see, but the idea that you have to, you know, that with the healthcare law, they said, well, you've got to prove it in order to know what's inside of it. That's what these guys are basically arguing, but it's BS. So, you know, the idea that you have to legalize mushrooms in order to see if there's some medical benefit is false on its face. So, you know, there is a mental health crisis in this country, no question about it, but it makes no sense whatsoever to just simply, you know, unleash, you know, powerful drugs on the streets. You know, we have doctors, we have pharmacists, we have researchers. Oftentimes what these folks, you'll find them say is, you know, well, we don't trust them, or, you know, they're not moving fast enough for us. And really what they're pushing for is a recreational marketplace. And who profits? Well, you're going to see a bunch of mushroom millionaires minted if this law passes. And it's all about the money. You know, follow the money. So, you know, this is not about compassion or care. This is about money, and this is about drugs, and this is about selling drugs. So these are poverty pimps. These are bad actors, and you know, they may come off with some, you know, compassion. You know, they put compassion up front, but it never ends there. It's not compassionate to get somebody hooked on heroin. It's not compassionate to get somebody hooked on meth. So it's not compassionate to get somebody hooked on psilocybin mushrooms. So there is a legitimate way to approach this. It's through medical researchers, it's through doctors, it's through pharmacists. You know, all these claims about marijuana is going to cure cancer, or, you know, do all kinds of other things. You know, if any of that is true, then let's do it right. Let's go through researchers and doctors and pharmacists. Let's not just open up a marketplace where, you know, it's just caused tremendous harm in Colorado. And, you know, increasingly, you know, more and more reports are showing that for very young people, when it comes to marijuana, very young people using powerful high potency marijuana, there are impacts on their cognitive ability, their memory, their psychic health. You know, we're unleashing so many problems on people your age and younger that really, you got enough problems. You don't need those problems.
Hoping to address concerns about the intent of the ballot initiative, Matthews argued that he did not have intentions for a recreational framework for magic mushrooms.
It makes sense to me that a parent would be, as a parent, that somebody is worried about their children having access to this. And what we're doing is we're not making it easier for people to actually obtain it. It's simple to grow, but it's not easy. And we believe that most people who actually use psilocybin use it very responsibly. And again, this isn't a recreational framework. You're not going to be able to go into a shop and actually purchase it. You've got to either grow it yourself, or you've got to grow it yourself. Under our language, sales are still against the law. Sales are considered still distribution of a controlled substance. People are concerned about individuals driving under the influence. That's one part of it. It's two. It's people who they're concerned about people who are driving under the influence, and they don't understand the distinction between legalizing and decriminalizing. A biggest question is so what, you can go buy this in shops if this passes, or go buy this at a dispensary? And the answer is absolutely not. That distinction between legalize and decriminalize, when you legalize something, there's essentially government oversight. It's regulated. Looking at the cannabis industry in Colorado as an example, it's heavily regulated. And a lot of those tax revenues go back to the state, into other programs. Whereas with decriminalizing, we're making possession, use, and cultivation the city's lowest law enforcement priority, and which simply means people won't get arrested for it unless they're causing harm to themselves or somebody else, right? And then we're also preventing the city from using any of its funds or resources to prosecute people. And so that's the biggest difference. We're decriminalizing, we're not legalizing. We're not ready for that yet. Education is the biggest part of this. Even right now as a campaign, these questions that people are asking with their valid concerns, we have to both address the concerns after the election, especially if it passes. What we've done with the campaign is we've opened this door. This isn't a one and done movement in Colorado or for the rest of the country. We need to make sure that people have access to the right information, so they know the risks, they know harm reduction or safety protocols, like what's the best environment and the best mindset to use psilocybin. But also, it's going to be our job as an organization to make sure that Denver residents are being educated and they have an opportunity to be educated, because this is an evolving conversation that doesn't end here in Denver. As I mentioned, California, Oregon, other jurisdictions here in Colorado, people who've reached out to our campaign and said, hey, we want to do this where we are. So education is, I think, the biggest piece.
With the Denver elections on May 7th, the city will face down the vote on what could become a nationwide first. But this vote may be just part of a trend towards the psychedelics. While California did not approve a magic mushroom legalization initiative in 2018, Matthews believes Denver's more narrow decriminalization may yet work, and he believes the conversation from Denver is only the start, as people have asked for his advice in crafting their own magic mushroom legislation, and Oregon is preparing a similar statewide question for 2020.
We're moving through something here. I can't put my finger on it. All I know is that, with this campaign, there's the potential to, with psilocybin has the potential to address some of these issues. There's five really big things that are going on right now with our population when it comes to, you've got depression, you've got addiction, you've got anxiety, you've got PTSD, and you have chronic pain, physical pain. And chronic physical pain is just your body's signal that you've got chronic mental pain, right? And so psilocybin can address all of those things. And that's why this is so exciting for us, is because we have a chance here to further this national conversation and potentially inspire an entire movement and spawn a new paradigm in healthcare.